Let's start with the first slide. In 1853, you want to move this down? Thank you. On July 8th, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay. He, during that time, set off a number of cannons, very powerful cannons, and told the Japanese that he was doing that to celebrate the 4th of July, which had happened earlier on. But it really was a show of power, a show of force, trying to get the Japanese to end a 220-year period of seclusion, whereby they had only filtered Western influence through the island of Deshima in Nagasaki Harbor. The Americans wanted trade relations with Japan. They wanted to establish themselves there before they were moved in by other European powers, but the Japanese still refused. So Perry said he was going to come back and that he would bring larger forces. This time he had only brought 4 vessels, but he would return the following year in February, which is what you see here on the screen, with 10 vessels and 1,600 men trying to force the Japanese hand. And here you see in this particular illustration one that was done by an artist that Perry brought with him, the approach of 27 boats into the bay, which led to the convention of Shimoda and Hakodate. Immediately afterwards, there was an exchange of gifts, and that exchange of gifts, I think, is very telling. It was, from the American side, gifts of technology, steam locomotives, telegraphs, books, and lots of whiskey. On the Japanese side, there were gifts of lacquer and porcelains. Now, the arrival in 1853 was, of course, a great political calamity for the Japanese, but I think for our purposes of our lecture today, where we're talking about art patronage, it also was a time of great visual disruption. Here in this slide, you can see a section of a hand scroll that belongs to the British Museum from Japanese artists looking at Commodore Perry's approach again into Edo Bay at the same time. I think you can look at this picture and see that already the Japanese had incorporated some ways of Western seeing. There is an attempt at perspective. There is a very low ground plane, but it still retains many of the elements of Japanese painting. But unlike what had happened in the past, where there had been gradual influence from the West coming through Deshima, coming through books, with the arrival of Perry, the Japanese were going to have to face a very sudden and abrupt transition. Today's title is, I've given the title of this lecture, An Eye for the Future, An Eye to the Past. And it is a pattern that we'll see throughout this first half and also the second half of my talk today, where we're looking at different influences, one's wanting very much to move forward, but at the same time, very much wanting to retain what was essentially Japanese. You might think that this would be just on the Japanese hand, but it was also true of Westerners who were coming into Japan. They wanted very much and had a very conflicted view about what should be done in Japan vis-a-vis the arts. And here I show you on the screen a photograph that was taken by Felice Beato, someone who was Italo-British, who traveled to Japan in 1863. Photographs itself had been introduced to Japan in 1848, but Beato was one of the most successful commercial photographers, and he really entered Japan at a time that Japan was mobilizing and ready to look at foreigners in their presence. Here in this shot, he takes a look at the Tokido Row. The Tokido Road, as you may remember, was the road that linked Kyoto to Edo, and it was very much traveled, and it was the basis for many woodblock prints. So here he takes one photograph. You can still see the men with their traditional Japanese hairstyles, that's still wearing the samurai were still wearing their swords. Here's another shot that he took of the town of Hakone, a very traditional view again, looking off into the distance. These become sort of prototypical pictures of how to look at Japan. But it's a view that's very much informed not just by Western ideas of what photography should be, but if you look at this comparison right now, you can see that Beato himself is looking to Japanese art. He has some idea of how he should present Japanese art. So he has one eye to the future, but he's also looking back to Japan's past in presenting his photographs. And here you see Hiroshige's print from the 53 stations of the Tokido Road, where a town that was Goyu, which was very well known for the women who came in and accosted the travelers, as you see right here, along this narrow corridor, again mirroring very much what Beato has done in his photograph. Beato became then sort of the forerunner for a group of artists, some foreigners, some Japanese, who created photographs called Yokoyama Shashin, or Yokohama photography. And I include one group of images that you have here at the Asian Art Museum. These photographers were very much taking Beato's view. They were creating photographs for all of the foreigners who are starting to come into Japan. And they're very sort of romanticized views, as you can see, much in the way that Beato was looking to Japan's tradition rather than to Japan's future. And you can see in this comparison how, again, woodblock prints often became the informants for photography that was done at the time. They were a type of looking, the exoticism of Japan was just something that was very much interest to foreigners at that time, and the Japanese were very willing to present themselves in that way. On the other hand, we look at something that is much more traditional, again, taking place in the 1860s, the traditional medium of the woodblock print, this being done by Japanese artists. They're very curious about the West. They're looking at new ways of presenting things, even though they're using a traditional medium. So you have here, on the left-hand side, an English couple. What do the Japanese find intriguing about the English couple? First of all, they walk arm in arm under an umbrella. They also find the woman's skirts to be something unfathomable. They just cannot figure out what in the world it is she's wearing. But they're also looking at, how is this depicted? Look at the shadowing, the attempt at modeling using a Japanese woodblock print. Or on the right side, a foreigner's dinner party becomes a subject of great curiosity. It's just not that men and women are eating together, conversing together, but it's also all the accoutrements that you find in the house. The lamps with the crystal sparklers on it, or the furnishings that are in the room, the drinking vessels. These are all things of great interest. But they're looking again to Western conventions. You can see the shadows underneath the tables. So again, it's not an easy fit of who's doing what for whom and how they're deciding to present it. So this is happening in the 1860s, but the topic of today's lecture is about the Meiji Era, from 1868 to 1912. And I'll go back and I'll show you, these are two more of these Yokohama prints that were done, this being about Americans, and they're looking and saying, not only do they have curious depictions of Americans, you have this woman seated on a horse, but obviously they're taking a print of a Native American and juxtaposing pictures. Or on the right-hand side, it's not only about this man on his horse, but the observation in the text also reads, they're trying to learn about America. They don't have a lot of direct contact, but they're trying to learn. And they say in the inscription, there is no king. In each state, a wise person governs with the support of many people. And furthermore, no class distinctions are established. In today's political world, I don't know how true that all is, but at least that's what the Japanese thought of our country in the 1860s. Most of this, again, was not through direct experience. So they're looking at sites around the world. This one looking at Paris, or what they thought Paris looked like. Again, taking from illustrated books, and sometimes you have sort of Moorish architecture interjected into Paris. And you, again, look at the women and their skirts. It seems to be something that great fascination. It's almost as if someone wants to lift that skirt up and see what's underneath all of that material. But again, a great curiosity on the part of the Japanese and a great attempt also to depict things in a Western way. But the topic today is the Emperor Meiji and the government that he established. It is a time when in 1868, when rival clans in Japan, the Satsuma and the Choshu, rose up against the remains of the Tokugawa shogunate and established the 15-year-old emperor, who you see on the left-hand side in traditional clothing, to assume real authority as the emperor. The dissatisfaction by these clans, by the Satsuma and the Choshu, largely stemmed because the Tokugawa shogunate had not been able to do anything about the so-called barbarians amongst their midst. But they decided that with the emperor, they would try a new strategy. And this government not only tried a rapid and really orchestrated a rapid set of changes in all phases, in all institutions throughout Japan. But for us, in terms of culture, they also had a new slogan, which was Bunmei Kaika, or civilization and enlightenment. So here we have on the left-hand side the emperor in 1872, and 1 year later, he's already decided to assume Western garb. You see him wearing a military uniform. His hair is cut now. I think he looks rather uncomfortable, but at least he's willing to sit for a photograph, which, if you've studied Japanese art in the past, you'll understand that before, you almost never saw the presence of the emperor in anything. He was often suggested, his presence was suggested, but to have an actual image of the emperor was quite revolutionary. Also at this time, we have the move of the capital from Kyoto to the city, which they now call Tokyo. So very rapid changes, and we can see some of these changes in the woodblock prints that were created during the time. Here we see a print done in 1882. We see the emperor, again wearing his military garb, on an outing to the very traditional temple, Sensoji, which you can see here in the background with its pagoda, and the members of his extended family, his concubines, the empress and the concubines surrounding him, all of whom are wearing traditional Japanese dress. But here's another depiction, 5 years later, of the emperor. Now he's seen as the focus of a nuclear family, like the ruling families of Europe would, with the empress and the crown prince. No one states at the time that the crown prince was actually not the son of the empress, but was the son through one of his concubines. But here creating an image of a nuclear family, a royal family, much as you'd encounter in the West, seated in Victorian-style chairs with this very brightly colored tablecloth in front of them. And the only suggestions really of the Japanese influences in the background. You have the Three Friends of Winter providing the backdrop for this particular print. Some of this rapid modernization and changing view of Japan occurred because the Japanese really decided to send out missions throughout the United States and Europe. They wanted to acquire knowledge. They thought that by acquiring knowledge, they could then more effectively deal with the threats they saw to their country. And you have to realize at the same time that the European powers are trying to colonize a lot of Asia, and Japan definitely wants to be able to preserve its own authority. So in 1871, they sent a mission under this man, Iwakura Tomomi, who was was probably Japan's foremost statesman of the time. And he got together a group of delegates, many of whom, again, were leading statesmen, and they traveled throughout the United States and Europe, and they went to study. So if they went to Prussia to study Constitution, they went to Prussia to study about the formation of an army, they went to to England to learn about naval things, they went to Italy to learn about art, they went to the United States to learn about constitutional government. And you can already see the difference in just this short period of time. There have been missions and students been sent out to go to major universities in the United States and in Europe. They first arrive in their early stages still with their swords, two swords, in traditional garb. But by the time of the Iwakura mission in 1871, They're already in Western dress, presenting themselves as Westerners. And we have Iwakura sending all of his different delegates to get their photographs taken in the United States and in Europe so that they know how to present themselves with these cards, which we call carte de visite. And carte de visite are like the modern day business card, except they're handier. They had pictures on them. So you would present them to someone when you met them. And it was very important in this initial meeting that they be able to present themselves in a way that they thought was commensurate with how they would be greeted by people in Europe and the United States. All of this gathering of knowledge moved very, very quickly. And by 1876, the Japanese were able to present themselves as a modernizing power, as one who was very competitive with all of the other world powers. And the primary forum for this was the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park. The Japanese had been invited, and international expositions at that time were sort of worldwide phenomena that were taking place in Europe and later in the United States, whereby different powers from the world would vie with each other to show off their technology, to show off their arts, to really sort of give the best face to themselves. And the Japanese accepted the invitation in 1873, and by 1876 they had produced over 7,000 items ready to present at the fair. The number of items they presented was third only to the United Kingdom and the United States. So this was very rapid mobilization. And the Japanese government decided to invest over $600,000 for the venture at the time. So one thing I want to stress throughout these two parts of this lecture today is when we talk about patronage during the Meiji era, one has to realize it is truly the force of the government trying in all ways to figure out how best to present Japan. And it is very, very, very orchestrated, and individuals buy into this agenda. Many artists, they may all have different ways of doing it, but they all buy into this agenda. The Philadelphia Centennial was actually a fabulous time for the Japanese to make their presence known. Over 38 nations participated in the fair, which took place from May 10th to November 10th in 1876. The fair itself had over 9.8 million visitors. Over 20% of Americans at the time went to the fair itself. So it was a great time for Japan to present itself, and you can see some photographs, and on the right-hand side, I include one of these carte de visite that was presented by General Saigo Tsugumichi, who is the brother of Saigo Takamori, a famous Japanese general. Here, he was one of the ones who led the delegation, and you can see already very much taking on the trappings of a Western diplomat as he goes about presenting his credentials and presenting his commission to the fair itself. The Japanese were very savvy, because on one hand, they knew that people already had some impressions and an excitement about Japan, much of it coming through photographs like you had seen by Beato, a very traditional Japan. So they had, as part of their display, a bazaar, very much in traditional Japanese architecture, and they had people dressed in traditional Japanese garb selling all kinds of wares. And it was very, very effective because within time, it sort of sparked a Japan craze across the country. People would buy things for their, for their homes. And to this day, I don't know whether it's so true on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, I get so many phone calls from people who tell me they have Japanese things in their home, and they're usually things that were acquired at this time, during this time of the Japanese craze. And it's also, it wasn't just the average person in the street. Major collectors went to this fair and developed their impression of who the Japanese were, what Japanese art was. It was all sort of coming through this fair. And so all of the major museums on the East Coast, that's how many of us got our beginnings. It was through this particular exposure. The signature part of it was not the bazaar part that you just saw, where everyday people could buy things. It was this big presentation in the main hall, And you can see that it was described as that they were just myriads of layered cakes of porcelains and bronzes that were created. It was quite, I mean, they had mobilized. They had gotten so many different craftsmen in Japan ready to present their wares here for the fair. For Americans and Europeans, this presentation was just mind-blowing. They had no expectation what the Japanese would present, and this was really Japan's declaration of, we have arrived, and this is all within this very short time span. And if you look up in here in the rafters, for instance, you can see there's a sign reading the Empire of Japan. Japan has made its presence known. And it really was the talk of the fair. And there were works such as this one, which is in the Philadelphia Art Museum, massive bronzes. All of this done to appeal to Western tastes, what they thought Westerners would want, what Westerners would be interested in. And people in the United States and Europe were fascinated because as the United States and Europe were going through the Industrial Revolution, where there were things that were not handmade and concerns about losing that craftsmanship, you have the Japanese arriving in Philadelphia with these works, massive works that were all handmade, so that there was this awe and just surprise at what the Japanese were to create. These are very different from what Japan was producing for its own domestic market. They were very, very conscious of how they wanted to project the image of the country through their participation in this particular fair. So you have this massive censer, which has a very traditional motif at the top. Let's see if you can see it right here. The lion dance. Let's see. There's the lion, his head right here, and the dancer right here. But a multi-tiered, huge bronze. And there are many such of these bronzes in it. Or this one, which is in the MFA collection. And I should just say that most of these works, if I do not identify a collection, they're in the MFA collection. I've identified as much as possible other collections. But here is this massive articulated dragon. It moves. It was one of those kinds of objects that would have fascinated people at the fair. Or these types of porcelains, large vases. This particular vase is of a type that you can see here in the back. I've got a blue arrow showing you. Whether it's this one or not, we haven't been able to determine, but something very similar, which then captured people like John Singer Sargent. When the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, a very well-known painting in our collection, you can see those vases in the background. So very quickly, things that were coming in from the fair are making their presence known in American wealthy families, and also with the things that were purchased at the bazaar. People of all backgrounds were able to purchase things from Japan. So Japan really made a very strong presence for itself, very, very conscious of how it was presenting itself, what it wanted the West to know about itself. They were also wanting to make sure that people felt as though Japan was preserving traditional values. It was very forward-thinking, but they also wanted to promote the sense of traditional design. And you have one such vase here at the Asian Art Museum, this one by a man, Miyagawa Kozan, who is known to have done porcelains, and he was based in the Yokohama area. And he had a great workshop, which you here see on the left-hand side, 18 potters and painters working with him, creating very high-quality porcelains. And he wanted to look at designs that were very traditional on his porcelains that he felt as though you could only see in times of painting. But he's very conscious, again, of how Westerners want to see works of art. The idea of these craftsmen at work, too, at the time, foreigners who came to Japan could be led to these tours so that they could see workmen at work, so they would feel as though they could see traditional Japan. Oftentimes these things were completely staged, but it was a sense of trying to present Japan as foreigners would want Japan to be seen. So again, it's very much for a look at consumer demand. So they're very much forward-thinking, but they're also aware that in a certain sense, a lot of Westerners are interested in tradition as well, and that's what made it intriguing. But Miyagawa himself was not just a traditional Japanese potter. I mean, he himself traveled around Europe, went to look at collections in England, France, and even it's thought that he went to Denmark so that he could look at the designs of Royal Copenhagen ceramics. But it's this view of Japan that was presented at the fairs and the types of things that had a great resonance in the United States. So you have at the Metropolitan these types of works with a vase on a wave, or here at the Asian Art Museum, lacquers that were made in the shape of fans. These are all kinds of objects that are being produced in Japan at this time, very much conscious of how to present Japan as this purveyor of finely crafted works of art, ones that would appeal to an industrialized West and appeal to the sense of familiar but not familiar. So that sense of exotic was something that was incredibly important. Now, paintings were not something that were widely sold at the fairs. The Japanese were not so sure that Westerners would be all that interested, but they did find that pictorial works in other different forms were greatly successful. So here is one. It's a cloisonné plaque in our collection that we purchased quite recently, done by Namikawa Sosuke, and it looks at a traditional scene. The 8 views of the Shawanshang rivers, and you can see the sailboats in the rain, or the moon over up in the clearing sky, and the temple bell. These are all very traditional themes done in cloisonné, so with wires hidden along the surface, but creating a very pictorial surface, and presenting it in the context of a Western frame. So again, looking like a Western picture. Or here you have here at the Asian, that's Shibata Zeshin's. This is a symbol of good luck. It's Daikoku's hammer, and it is a combination of lacquer and picture at the same time. And Shibata Zeshin was one of those artists that was greatly beloved by early Western connoisseurs because he had this great pictorial sense, but it also the sense of craft and the fineness of the craft. And if you look at the way that he manipulates the lacquer surface and the different types of effects, these are all things that would have been greatly appealed to people in the West, as well as gradually in Japan itself as taste changed. Or Zeshin did this sort of lacquer painting. It's in a hanging scroll format here at the Asian. Again, looking at a pictorial form, you've got a cicada on a tree, but this is done in lacquer, on paper. But these are the kinds of sort of virtuosic performances, or something like this, that was very much appreciated in the United States and in Europe. Here's one that we have at the Museum of Fine Arts that I purchased recently, which is a plaque. Again, you've got the sense of a Western frame around it, and then the pictorial surface of the vegetable nirvana. So you've got the daikon taking the place of the reclining Buddha. And you've got the different vegetables creating the disciples, the grieving disciples. But this is a theme that is known in traditional Japanese art, but even people in the West would not have any difficulty appreciating it just for its naturalistic appearance. This type of art, which highly resonated in the West, also developed its own following in Japan, and this particular piece was purchased, was by a member of the Iwanosuke family, the Iwasaki family, and has been in Japan ever since, but it's a kind of a Japan responding to the West and changing taste in Japan again because of that interaction. But there were a few paintings from this time. So you have here on the right-hand side a painting by Watanabe Seitei of a rabbit under the moon, or one that we have in the MFA collection of geese. But these are kinds of paintings that were very much playing to interest in the West, very naturalistic treatment of the animals themselves, very abbreviated background, things that they knew that would appeal to both audiences. So the Japanese are very conscious at these fairs of how they're presenting themselves, how to get the West to buy into their own culture, introducing it in ways that are approachable to members of the Western public. For their own domestic market, they were also trying to promote the government's agenda. And so here are I'm going to show you some woodblock prints. Woodblock prints, before this time, as you may know from previous lectures in Japan, before the Meiji era, it was forbidden by censorship rules to show current events. And all of a sudden, the Meiji government decides, and it's a very conscious decision, that, in fact, they want current events shown, that current events could become something that then becomes a source of great information for the public. It's a way of presenting the government's point of view. So here you have a picture of the Empress and members of her court engaged in Western musical performances at a place called the Rokumeikan, which is a Western structure that was built by a British architect. It was a place where Westerners and Japanese could meet, the elites could meet, and it was where the Japanese would have Western meals and perform in Western dances. But you can also see just in the adoption of Western dress, everything about it. But this was a way to promote with domestic audiences the agenda that was being produced for the Meiji era of rapid modernization, modern Westernization, but within a Japanese context. Or this print here of, just a second, I want to go back to this one. You might notice also that in these prints there are these very strong reds and purples, and these are called the colors of progress. The Japanese were it's not a palette you would have seen during the Edo period. It's a palette that you often see in these prints that are done during the Meiji era. And again, red and purple being associated with something new, something revolutionary, something that you want to pay attention to. But you can see very quickly, this is a print showing the Azuma Bridge, a new construction bridge, very much in the Western style, going over the Sumida River. And look at the river. On the right-hand side, you have in the background, you have Sensoji, the traditional Edo temple, but in front of it, you have an explosion, the torpedo explosion that's going on here in the water. Or on the left-hand side, you see crew boats, racing boats here. And then just in terms of who's wearing what, most of the people here are wearing Western clothing. So it's promoting Western bridges, Western-style buildings, Western parks, just Western entertainment. Here again, using the colors of progress, you have prints that are celebrating the opening of the Imperial Diet in 1890. The new Meiji Constitution was being presented in 1889. It was based on a Prussian model, again, after the Japanese had studied different Western institutions. They're bringing it all together, and they're presenting it so everyone can see it, both for a domestic audience and for a Japanese audience. But you have to understand, this is happening in such a short time period. Almost as soon as the country is open, they know how to mobilize. It's a real orchestrated campaign. And it is one very much in which they are looking to see what is the government's agenda? How can we promote this? How can we get the whole country and getting buy-in from most of their citizens while they're doing this? Not only were they doing it for domestic purposes, this was also to declare Japan's position in the world. They did not want to become one of the colonized countries, and it happens militarily, preparation in terms of different governmental bodies and institutions, but it also happens very much on an art level. And I can show you just one example of how this all works. Japan engaged in two major sets of wars during the Meiji era. From 1894 to 1895 was the Sino-Japanese War. 1904-1905 was the Russo-Japanese War. Everyone was surprised in 1894. Everyone thought China was such a big country. Who was Japan to sort of contest what was happening in Korea? The Japanese wanted to secure Korea so that it protected their own interests. Everyone just assumed that China would prevail. But the Japanese, taking this very rapid modernization that they had done, were stronger militarily, but they were very good negotiators. They were very good tacticians, and I can show you how it works on an art level. So it's all very orchestrated. When we talk about the Meiji era and talking about looking at patronage during this time, and presentation during this time, it's very much government controlled, or at least getting the government's agenda in mind. So that in the upper left-hand corner, you have a print, a Western print. This is actually taken out of a Western journal, kind of remarking on how did the Japanese do this. So on one hand, you have a print showing a Western battle. This was taken, I believe, from the Crimean War, here on the left-hand side. Someone from Japan has taken that, and this is how they're showing the Sino-Japanese War. So they've taken elements of the Western drawing and incorporated them into the Japanese print. I can't produce the actual print, but I can show you one in the MFA collection that shows you some of these same principles at work. They look to see how is the West showing military conflict. How does the West present these? Because by showing it in Western visual terms, they are then able to take that viewpoint and present themselves in that exact same way. Just to show you the print itself. And if you notice one thing in the upper right-hand corner, the left-hand corner, you have it all written in Japanese. In the right-hand corner, you have it written in English. So they're very aware of who's the audience for this. It's not just a domestic audience. This is very much something being very conscious of what the West is also thinking about what they're doing. I'm going to show you how this works also with another example. This is a print that was in the MFA collection, taken from the Russo-Japanese War. 10 years after the Japanese basically defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, they then, many of the issues that they felt had not been resolved, sort of raised their head again over control of Korea, this time with the Russians. And so this is a print that shows, as you can see, it's labeled both in Japanese and in English, if you can see up in the corner. Lieutenant Commander Yamanaka, chief gunner of our ship Fuji, fights fiercely in the naval battle at the entrance to Port Arthur. It's all written there for everyone to read. It looks like a very spontaneous presentation, but there are a lot of things that are at work in just this one print. Compare these two prints. One at the top is from the Russo-Japanese War. The one on the bottom is another Japanese print from the Sino-Japanese War, 10 years earlier. There are very strong resemblances in these two sets of prints. One thing that they have in common is look at the soldiers. They all look like they're Western. The Japanese soldiers are Westernized. Their features are Westernized. They're very aware of who this audience is for these prints. It's not just internal. It's also for a foreign audience, and it's a way of identifying themselves with Western powers. But we can also look at this combination of prints and look at the one at the bottom, and then look at this illustration from a Western magazine that was done during the time of the Crimean War. What seems to document an actual event is actually looking to a Western prototype, copying it almost verbatim, but substituting Japanese figures for the Western figures. It's a way of incorporating. It's not only, as we've been talking about the Meiji Era, it's not just about learning about institutions. It's learning about a whole way of seeing and presenting themselves that was so effective in how Meiji Japan presented itself and got from being those Yokohama prints with the women with the poofy skirts to something like this in a very short amount of time. It really means that all Western types of visualization have been so thoroughly internalized that they identify with it and they can present themselves that way if they want to. You can look at prints by these same artists and they can show domestic scenes, and you wouldn't be able to tell much difference if you weren't trained to look at an Edo period beautiful woman as opposed to a Meiji beautiful woman. But when you look at these prints that are meant for political events, it's very much, they can take Western visual language, present the Japanese in those exact terms, and it's very, very effective. It's a very strong visual statement of the Japanese are just the equal of anybody else in this world. And it really takes full expression in this particular illustration, which you can see is a Western. It's the Illustrated London News. Now, I have to explain how this all works, but the Japanese invited Western journalists to come to Japan at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. They kind of kidnapped them, though, in a way. They kept them all well entertained, and any of you who've gone to Japan know you can be wined and dined and wined and dined, and you wonder, when is the business going to happen? Well, this is kind of what happened in Japan at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. They invited all these Western correspondents to come in. They wined them and dined them in Tokyo. And everyone thought they were going to get to the front. They didn't get to the front. They would have Japanese go to the front, provide sketches, provide drawings for the Western correspondents, or photographs that were very much filtered. So that some of these things are exactly when Westerners went back and reported for their own news organizations, they're reporting it using illustrations that the Japanese have done. Now, it's only possible if you've got a nation that's already mobilized itself to present itself in a way that Westerners can understand. But that's what they've done. In this very short period of time, they have taken the imagery, they have mastered Western imagery so well and Western ways of presentation that they can become the filter, and no one's understanding that that's exactly how propaganda gets produced. But everyone bought this, and here it is on the cover of the Illustrated London News, proclaiming, Japan's position in these wars, with all of these original designs having been done by the Japanese, but now being presented by Western journalists. So that type of control of visualization is something that they're very, very aware of during this time period, and how Japan presents itself. For one, on one hand, they preserve for the domestic purposes, very much preserving Japanese tradition, but they're very aware if the future means negotiating between the East and the West, how is it best to negotiate it? So that is how patronage happened during the Meiji Era. It was very much the government, a centralized government, producing these things that then, as you'll see in the second part of this talk, get interpreted in very different ways, and different artists giving expression in different ways. But there is a certain amount of buy-in, that there's a common purpose for the country, and everyone's going to make it move forward. So I will stop here for this part of it, and hope you'll join me.